Hi there. This is another one of my working models to understand the worlds of the demiurge and the human condition therein. This is rather a work in progress. I'm not sure I quite understand it myself, really. But here we have a triangle made up of razors, and the inner circle is the self, the inner self, and the circle here is the outer self, or the self of not I, and the self of I is in the inner part. I'm not quite sure what those mean or what the distinction there means in this context. So basically, creativity or creation, creative acts, creative processes, creative algorithms. You have a double edged razor, and the razor cuts the outer sheath of the self, and it also at the same time cuts the inner part of the self. And then this bit is the preserving part, which cuts only the outer part of the self. And then the third is the destructive mode of existence, which cuts the inner part of the self, but not the outer. And then I wrote a poem called The Human Condition, in which I said that tried to relate the poem to this model. And underneath the nice guy, which is this creative part, um, there is there is in fact Mr. Nasty, who is attributed to the preserving part of this model, simply because, as I understand it, the Mr. Nasty is trying to preserve the inner core of self. In the only way that Mr. Nasty can possibly do that, which is by being defensive. And of course, as Napoleon said, the best form of defense is attack, is offense. And then finally, the destructive, as represented by underneath Mr. Nasty, is Mr. Frightened. And Mr. Frightened is frightened because the forces of the universe are directed, so he thinks, or so he perceives, at his inner core. And they seem to be piling in on top of him, and from a sort of position out there, and coming in here, sort of thing. So there's a kind of a thought there of invasion, or principle of invasion being expressed. But underneath Mr. Frightened, of course, is just an ordinary guy waiting to die, eating pie. Um, and doesn't it all want to make you cry? And this is really the human condition. This is really existence as we know it, in the worlds of the demiurge. And I'm right back to expressing pessimism and despondency and despair at the way things are in this particular realm, in the realms of the demiurge and under the sway of the demiurge. And this is the prison of the three razors in which the soul is trapped. And there's some kind of outer self and inner self. But I think perhaps the soul, then, our heart, spark soul, is in the midst of the inner self. And this alone, this part alone of consciousness, has the ability, the power to transcend the worlds of the demiurge, and to transcend the machinations of the three razors. And of course, the three razors also represent Mercury, Mercury, sulfur, and salt, of course, in the alchemical system. And so the creative is a mercurial, and which is represented roughly by that symbol. And then you've got sulfur, which is the destructive. Or sulfur is the preserving side, in fact, in this system. For some reason I can't draw. Oh, come on. And that's a symbol for or sulfur. And then finally, the destruction, or tamas, as it might be thought of in the Hindu alchemy, is salt. And that's destruction, a leaden Saturnian quality. So, as I say, it seems that these are the three modes of existence: creativity, preservation, and destruction. And the destructive forces, preserving forces, and creative forces, and they kind of conspire, as it were, to surround us with their various modalities. And they cut the inner self, or they cut the outer self, or both. And this is also represents the duality of the worlds of the demiurge as well. So the big D goes in here somewhere. But as I say, it's a bit of a strange model, a bit of a work in progress. And I suppose the moral of the story here is not to put any of your ultimate trust in such a conspiring system, or a system that conspires to cut both your inner and outer aspects of self. Even though the soul is a transcendent part of all this, and doesn't take any notice of the three razors, and either transmutes the razors in some way, or transcends them, or both. And so I don't know whether this is any help to you at all in understanding. Um, I'm not sure what this actually proves or disproves as such, really. I don't even know if models are supposed to prove or disprove assumptions, or support assumptions in any way. And a lot of people, are probably not exactly dispirited, but credulous, or rather incredulous, about the facts of the worlds of the demiurge are quite so bad. And as I've said before, I mean, the preserving and the creative account for 60% of everything, and the destructive only 30%. And yet the whole thing is duality, and the way that creativity, cuts both sides. It's a two-edged sword, which I think it is. Whereas preserving and even destruction are only one-edged swords, and the other side of the sword is blunt. And so if you're on one side or the other, you don't get hurt by the preserving forces, or the destruction, or even the destructive forces, which is why sometimes destructive forces can seem more appealing, in fact, than the creative forces, according to this model, anyway. So I'll park it there. A bit of a strange entry, this, really, and I hope it's of some vague use to you in the way that you are looking at how to how to define the way things are.